أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الشمس والقمر بحسبان والنجم والشجر يسجدان والسماء رفعها ووضع الميزان.
Dear guests and colleagues, it's my pleasure to announce the opening of the first stroke conference of the Egyptian Society of Neurology, Psychiatry and Neurosurgery. This event reflects the importance of the stroke burden in Egypt, which affects 250,000 patients per year. 70,000 of them will die, and the rest will be left with great disability. Stroke is not only a preventable disease. Now actually it's a treatable disease if the patient receives the proper treatment in the golden hours, in the first few hours. But unfortunately most of the people and patients and even some physicians, they don't know that. And also the treatment is expensive and sometimes unavailable. Stroke awareness and management was neglected for so many years in Egypt, but in the last years there has been a great achievement, and the momentum of this achievement is continued, reflected by the presence of the Minister of Health represented by Dr. Ahmad Kazim and the deans of our faculties in Cairo University, Dr. Hala Salah, and the dean of the Faculty of Medicine at Ain Shams University, Dr. Mahmoud al-Bitini. And I appreciate very much their presence despite their tight schedule. We are honored to have 14 guests coming from all over the world to share their experience from very distant places, even from Australia. Yesterday we had a great activity in the workshops. Many of these activities were done for the first time in Egypt. Also, just before the opening, we had a joint session with the cardiologists, which is something new. In addition, as we just heard, Dr. Christian Forge already announced that he's proposing a joint project between Germany and Egypt regarding stroke. Also, Dr. Haroun announced the start of the public campaign of stroke awareness. And most important, I know that Dr. Ahmed, representing the Minister of Health, is having something to announce, and this will be a big event. And at the end, I wish you all a very fruitful meeting. To our guests, I would like to say to them, have a nice day in Egypt, and thank you.
Now the word of Dr. Nabil Al-Agouz. He is president of the stroke chapter of the Egyptian Society of Urology, Psychiatry and Neurosurgery.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. أساتذتي الأفاضل، زملائي الأعزاء، أبنائنا الأفاضل، السادة العمداء، الأستاذ الدكتور محمود المتيني عميد كلية طب عين شمس، الأستاذة الدكتورة هالة صلاح عميد كلية القصر العيني، السادة الأفاضل. أنا أقول كلمة وهتبقى باللغة العربية. وطبعا كلمة السكتة الدماغية بيعود استعمالها قديمة. ففي سبعينات القرن العشرين عرفت منظمة الصحة العالمية السكتة الدماغية على أنها خلل في الجهاز العصبي نتيجة خلل في الدورة الدموية للمخ يستمر لأكثر من 24 ساعة أو يسبب الوفاة في غضون 24 ساعة. ومع توافر سبل العلاجات التي يمكن أن تقلل من حدوث السكتة الدماغية عند أعطائها في وقت مبكر، يفضل الكثيرون استخدام مصطلحات بديلة: نوبة دماغية أو متلازمة وعائية دماغية انفرادية حادة، وذلك على غرار النوبة القلبية ومتلازمة الشريان التاجي الحاد على التوالي، لتعكس مدى العجلة في أعراض السكتة الدماغية والحاجة إلى التصرف بسرعة. وجدير بالذكر أن حقن الجسم بمنشط التيشو بلازمينوجين اكتيفيتنج فاكتور يعتبر هو العلاج الذهبي المثالي لعلاج السكتة الدماغية، حيث يتم الحقن عن طريق الوريد، ويعتبر أفضل وقت لهذا الدواء خلال 3 ساعات من الأمر، ولكن قد يتم استخدامه بعد مرور 4 ساعات ونص من بدء أعراض السكتة الدماغية. يساعد هذا الدواء على عودة تيار الدم، وذلك من خلال إذابة الجلطة الدموية المسببة للسكتة الدماغية، كما يساعد في تعافي بعض الأشخاص بصورة كاملة. وقد يقوم الأطباء أحيانا بعلاج السكتة الدماغية من خلال إجراء عاجل للأوعية الدموية يتم عمله داخل الوعاء الدموي المسدود، وهو واحد من الإجراءات التي يجب أن يتم عملها بأسرع وقت ممكن، وذلك اعتمادا على شكل الجلطة الدموية. فهم معتقدات المريض من السكتة الدماغية أمر هام جدا، بالذات في نموذج التدخلات العلاجية الحديثة التي توصي بالكفاءة الثقافية للتعامل مع المريض. فقد يعتقد المريض أن المسبب شيء آخر وعنصر آخر ثقافي غير طبي، وبالتالي ينزع المريض إلى اتخاذ قرارات علاجية ثقافية قد تتعارض معها وبقوة في أحيان أخرى، وخاصة أن النموذج الثقافي الذي يؤثر سلبيا قد يتداخل مع الإدارة الطبية للحالات قبل التدخل العلاجي الطبي وأثناء التدخل الطبي ثم يستمر بعده. ومن هذا المنطلق قامت الجمعية المصرية للأمراض العصبية والنفسية وجراحة المخ والأعصاب من خلال شعبة الأزمة الدماغية، وهي إحدى شعب الجمعية، وتضم نخبة من أساتذة الجامعات المختلفة والمتخصصين في علاج السكتة الدماغية بإطلاق حملة التوعية بمرض السكتة الدماغية لرفع التوعية بأسباب حدوثها المختلفة وإزالة ما يحيط بأذهان الناس من معتقدات خاطئة حول مرض السكتة الدماغية تحت شعار بإيدك تنقذ حياتك من جلطة المخ خلال ال4 ساعات الأولى من الإصابة بأعراضها، مما يترتب عليه إنقاذ حياتك من الوفاة أو العجز والإعاقة وتجنب حدوث الشلل. كما قامت الشعبة بعقد العديد من المؤتمرات الإقليمية بالاشتراك مع الجامعات المختلفة لعمل المزيد من التوعية للأطباء الجدد والأهل المرضى، وذلك بالاشتراك مع الشركة المسؤولة عن دواء التيشو بلازمينوجين اكتيفيتنج فاكتور الاتيليز. وفي الختام لابد بالأخذ بالتوصيات العلمية العالمية والمؤكدة على أهمية الفهم والإدارة الطبية لحالات المرضى ضمن توازن وفهم مع المدرك الثقافي وبما يعزز معايير الكفاءة الثقافية وإدارة الحالات المرضية بفاعلية ولحماية المرضى من الانخراط في تدخلات علاجية غير مثبتة علميا وغير معروفة العواقب. وشكرا.
Now is the president of the Egyptian Society of Neurology, Psychiatry and Neurosurgery, Dr. Mahmoud Haroun, Professor of Neurology at Ain Shams University.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السادة عماد الأستاذ الدكتور عماد الكاظم رئيس المجالس المتخصصة نيابة عن وزيرة الصحة. الأستاذ الدكتور محمود المتيني عميد كلية الطب جامعة عين شمس. الأستاذة الدكتورة هالة صلاح عميد كلية الطب جامعة القاهرة. السادة الزملاء والإخوة الأبناء، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. نرحب بكم في مؤتمركم The First International Egyptian Stroke Conference، وذلك بالتعاون مع الجمعية المصرية للأمراض العصبية وجراحة المخ والأعصاب والأمراض النفسية، وكذلك مع مينا ستروك أورجانيزيشن، وكذلك مع أنجل أورجانيزيشن ومع اليوروبيان ستروك أورجانيزيشن. وننتهز الفرصة أن نرحب بالسادة الضيوف من جامعات مصر المختلفة ونرجو لهم طيب الإقامة، كما نرحب بالسادة المشاركين الأجانب. أيها السادة، إن اهتمام جامعات مصر بمرضى السكتة الدماغية له الشيء الممدوح، وذلك لتقليل العبء المادي والمعنوي والاجتماعي لمرضى السكتة الدماغية. وبالنيابة عن جمعية الأمراض العصبية وجراحة المخ والأعصاب والأمراض النفسية، فإننا نشكر كل المساهمين في المؤتمر ونتمنى لهم التوفيق والسداد، وأن يخرج المؤتمر بالشكل اللائق والناجح إن شاء الله. Dear guests, I have the opportunity to welcome you at our conference, the first International Egyptian Stroke Conference, in collaboration with the Egyptian Society of Neurology, Neurosurgery and Psychiatry, MENA Stroke Organization, Angel and European Stroke Organization. I hope good stay in Egypt, the place of old ancient civilization. On the behalf of Egyptian Society of Neurology, Neurosurgery and Psychiatry, we thank you for coming. We appreciate your contribution to our conference and its success. We are looking for more cooperation, especially for the benefit of young generation and the forthcoming progress in this branch. Thank you very much. نعلن عن إطلاق الحملة القومية للتوعية بالسكتة الدماغية، وذلك بالاشتراك مع شركة بورينجر، ودي كانت يعني البداية، هتكون إن شاء الله موفقة من النهاردة going on للإعلان عن التوعية المجتمعية، لأنها integral component لمرضى لعلاج ومدخل أساسي لعلاج السكتة الدماغية. وشكرا.
The word of Dr. Hala Salah, the Dean of the Faculty of Medicine, Cairo University.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to be here today with all of you. I think the topic and the speciality of such meetings is very important to everybody. Me, myself, I got a very important information from a very nice talk of Dr. Hassan, because everybody, not only doctors and physicians, but everybody must be very well oriented with signs and symptoms, especially the duration is very short. and it will make a lot of difference in the morbidity and mortality of many patients. I wish for everybody today and tomorrow a very fruitful workshop and conference. I saw the photo yesterday of your workshop at late yesterday, and from the number of attendees, I think it's a very, very important workshop, and the coming 2 days will be added value for everybody here. Thank you very much.
Now the word of Dr. Mahmoud al-Mitini, the Dean of Faculty of Medicine at Shams University, my university.
Thank you very much, Hani, for inviting me to be with you during the opening ceremony of such a very distinguished meeting. And it's my pleasure actually to be among you all, and especially that it's Egyptian Society of Neurology and not only at Shams. So I'm always pleased to be with my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Hala Salah, the Dean of Faculty of Medicine at Cairo University, and other faculties if you are there. And I'm sure that this is a real get-together for everybody involved in the neurology, and especially in stroke, as a really very hot topic these days, as mentioned by my colleague Dr. Hala. And of course, I'd like always delighted to be with my dear friend Dr. Kazim from the Ministry of Health. And it's very good, really thrilling that seeing people working together from the universities, the armed forces, the Ministry of Health, and towards the best outcome of our patient in a given stroke unit and I worked with my dear friend Dr. Magda when he was heading the department. We had long talks about that. Maybe our stroke unit is not big enough, and I know that you're ambitious to get it bigger and bigger, and it was my promise to Hani and Mahmoud and all the faculty that we're going to make a separate, and we'll get it out of the neurology department, we'll make a separate, big enough up to your ambitions, inshallah, within the coming few months. And I would like to thank you for your continuous effort and the impact, again, in clinical research that I can see over the past few months and years growing, and we need this kind of clinical research more and more. Lastly, I would like to welcome, of course, all our foreign guests from all over the globe. I went very rapidly through the very rich programs that you have. So I noticed that you have visitors from Europe, from Saudi Arabia, from Lebanon, and from Australia, from New Zealand. So thank you very much for taking the time and effort for coming over to our country. And please, of course, I wish you a very fruitful 2 days meeting, and then stay a little bit more and get benefit of our good weather. It was raining yesterday, but the coming few days will be good. Egypt is very nice weather, whether in Cairo, Greater Cairo, or south of Egypt, or wherever. Please get the maximum out of it, because these days are very cold in your countries, and it's very warm here that you can really see a lot of things and enjoy it. Thank you very much, and I wish you a very successful meeting.
And now, with the big expected news, because actually the Minister of Health should have been with us, but unfortunately they had a meeting, so of course.
But officially, she told me that Dr. Ahmed will represent her for this announcement, and please, Dr. Ahmed.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. في البداية بحب أشكر جمعية الأعصاب بجميع فروعها على هذه الدعوة الكريمة، وبخص بيها الأستاذ الدكتور محمود هارون، الدكتور هاني، الدكتور مجد، الجميع. يعني أنا بقول إن إحنا في التعاون كمجالس طبية وكوزارة صحة، يمكن جمعية الأعصاب المصرية من أنشط الجمعيات في التعاون لوضع بروتوكولات، مش هنقول مصرية، لا، بروتوكولات عالمية، ويمكن أحسن المنظومات عندنا جوه نفقة الدولة بروتوكولات الMS والستروك يونت. يمكن مع الوزير السابق الدكتور أحمد عماد ابتدت منظومة الاستروكيومنت ليها لجنه مشكله يقودها الدكتور مجد. ابتدينا كوزاره في موضوع اصدار قرارات نفقه الدوله على موضوع الثرومبوليسيس. ويمكن بمناسبه ان احنا بنقول ان احنا عام 18 الوزاره حددته لعام الاعاقه، وبالتعاون مع الجمعيه احنا بنقول ان الاعاقه مش مجرد الوزاره ان هي بتقول للمعاقين فقط، لكن كمان للحد وللبريفنشن من حصول الاعاقه. ويمكن عشان كده معالي الوزيره قبلت ان هي التعاون بين الجمعيه والستروك اكاديمي اللي معموله فيها اليونت جوه الجمعيه ان هي تدخل قرارات انترفنشن ثرومبوكتين ضمن قرارات نفقه الدوله عشان يبقى اكتمال المنظومه داخل الستروك ما تبقاش الموضوع مجرد ان انا اديت البيشنت الثرومبوليسيس وفين ووقف البيشنت كده، لا ان احنا بنكمل له المنظومه بتاعته طالما في جزء افكتفنس للقرار اللي هيطلع، فما بيبقاش مهم التكلفه على حساب البيشنت. ودي الرساله اللي بتبلغها معالي الوزيره لجميع اعضاء الجمعيه. شكرا.
Everybody for his attendance, Dr. Ahmed, Dr. Yala, Dr. Mahmoud, and of course we appreciate your presence despite your very high schedule, and we hope that your contribution also to the stroke, pushing of the stroke service in Egypt will be greatly appreciated. Thank you again very much.
It is a pleasure and honor for me to introduce one of the eminent and distinguished specialists in the field of intervention neuroradiology, Professor Michael Suderman. He is Chief Intervention Neuroradiology, Department of Neuroradiology, Karolinska University Hospital, Stockholm, Sweden Institution for Clinical Neuroscience, Karolinska Institute, Stockholm, Sweden. He is a member of several other societies. He is having more than 102 interventional publications, and currently he is the president of World Federation for Intervention and Therapeutic Neuroradiology. Topic of Professor Michael: Stroke and Cerebral Headache.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction. I see now that on the slide here actually it doesn't say that I'm also the president of the World Federation of Interventional Therapeutic Radiology, and it's an honor for me to be invited to this very nice meeting, congress, and workshop. And of course, we would also like to continue this collaboration as much as possible. So thank you very much to the organizers, and I also hope very much that the rest of this workshop and the rest of this meeting will be as good as it started, which is great. So this topic that I have chosen is stroke and cerebral hypoperfusion. This is a little bit off what we've been discussing previously, but I think you've heard, basically you've heard a lot about thrombolysis and thrombectomy, and this is a little different, but it has relevance for you. These are my disclosures. So, this is what we have been discussing a lot. I don't know if you have ever seen this, but this is what the clot looks like when it actually enters the brain and lodges in an artery. This is a soft clot. It's the most common type of clot, and as you can see here, it kind of goes first into one branch, and then into the other one, and then it stops there. So this is what you want to get out, and this is what we usually do. Either with aspiration or with a stentriver. And this is a stentriver, this is how it looks like when it's working. Okay. So it catches the clot, and in some of the devices the clot actually goes into the device, and then and this is what we want to do, but this is not always the problem. So, thrombectomy has a very high rate of reperfusion, and actually it's one of the most effective treatments in medicine. The reperfusion after thrombectomy is from the beginning, in the failed study, it was very low actually, but those studies are not relevant anymore. In the historic studies, it was around 70%, and then it has increased, and in some studies it's up to 90%, that is actually where we can achieve a good recanalization. Now the reperfusion rate is very, very nice, but it can obviously be increased. On the other hand, the good clinical outcome is not exactly following the reperfusion rate. And this could actually be because we are now including in these studies patients we not have included before. So it might be that the material is not exactly the same. But still, despite that, what we have here is a 60% good clinical outcome in some of the studies, which is absolutely fantastic regarding the material that we start out with. But this is just thrombectomy, and thrombectomy is not always the answer to all our questions. So what is the current dogma? For large vessel occlusion, the mechanical thrombectomy is superior treatment if there is a penumbra. And that's all the modern studies agree with that. Patients should be selected by clinical presentation and imaging. So the point here is that you have clinical presentation and imaging. And if you don't have a penumbra, if you don't have an area of hyperperfusion, you can't help the patient with the thrombectomy or any other revascularization. But time is very, very important. Time determines the fraction of patients that may benefit from revascularization. And that is that if you have 100 patients and you start that get a stroke from a big clot, an embolus, in the beginning, if you could treat them all immediately, almost all of them would benefit. But then some of the patients could have good collaterals in the brain, over the surface of the brain, so the area, the volume of brain that is supplied by this artery that is now blocked will live. But this is different in different people. So in some people, this collateral system is very, very important, and they actually don't even realize that they have a stroke. Nothing happens to them. Other people have very bad collaterals, and they develop an infarction immediately, and in the whole territory. So time is important because it determines the fraction of patients that may benefit. But once the patient has been properly examined and you realize that there is an area of hyperperfusion, an area of penumbra, then you can still treat the patient. But this fraction is smaller and it becomes smaller and smaller as long as time goes by. So there is basically no absolute time limit for reperfusion. And the latest studies are DAWN and DIFFUSE, where you can see that reperfusion in properly selected patients is actually a good treatment in up to 24 hours. So what are we talking about? Well, this is a graph from a very nice publication from 2011. So here you have the cerebral blood flow, here you have the time, and here you have the normal function of the brain. So the brain functions normally if the cerebral blood flow is allowed 25 grams per milliliter per minute. So now below that, there is something called the penumbra, the hypoperfusion. And this area where the brain is still alive but doesn't work is big in the beginning and then it becomes smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller as the infarction increases. So as time goes by, this infarction will increase in size, and obviously the number of patients that actually have a penumbra here will be smaller and smaller. But they still exist. So we have chronic hypoperfusion. This is beyond the time span of acute stroke. This doesn't mean that they can't be treated or shouldn't be treated. It just means that they have to be selected properly and helped properly. So chronic cerebral ischemia, hypoperfusion, was actually before the big carotid stenting trials believed to be a major reason for cerebral infarction. People thought that this was the major reason why people got infarction, not actually embolism. And the current focus, as I showed you at the beginning, is on treatment and prophylaxis and embolic events, but chronic ischemia can be symptomatic and may not be uncommon. And what I'm going to show you now are some cases of chronic ischemia because of carotid occlusion or carotid stenosis. But this also applies to what was discussed before, which is intracranial stenosis. And this is a problem when it comes to treatment, diagnosis and treatment of intracranial stenosis, because it's hard to say whether the symptoms come from a hypoperfusion or whether the symptoms are from embolism, embolic problem. And the treatment is obviously different. So in hypoperfusion, you will likely not help the patient with any anti-aggregation, while anti-aggregation might be helpful in a patient that suffers from an embolic problem. And also a patient with hypoperfusion might benefit very well from the stenting. That might not be the case with a patient that actually has an embolic problem. So this will affect the way you look at your patients, even if this stenosis is intracranial. So this is one of the first patients we actually had. You can see the history here. He had an acute paresis left arm and hand, and it fluctuated, and it came with this CT at admittance. And here you can see that there are some small infarctions there and there. These infarctions are in the so-called watershed area, the area where the supply comes from different territories. So this is the first part of the brain to suffer, because the perfusion here is not as good as in the rest of the brain. So this area here is in the deep perfusion, deep watershed territory, where they have arteries coming from below the brain and up and into the brain, and also arteries coming from the surface and into the brain. And this one is in another place where you have this watershed phenomenon. So what happened with this guy? Well, he had the right internal carotid artery occluded. I don't show that here, but the right one was occluded here. So he only had the left one open. You see the stump of the left one there. He didn't have any posterior communicating arteries, so his circular Willis was broken. He had a tiny anterior communicating artery. So his right cerebral hemisphere actually lived on the little flow that would come this way, from the left side. So we offered him, he was one of the first patients, and we offered him recanalization. This was his perfusion imaging. This is a very old perfusion imaging, that's why it looks a little strange. But here you have a perfusion deficit, an increased mean transit time. So the guy was offered recanalization. He was on board for it. He wanted to consider the procedure, and time went by. And 5 weeks later, he was suddenly hemiplegic. So his collaterals didn't work anymore. And he had this large right-sided MCA infarction. Hypoperfusion have some particular symptoms and signs. It's like a non-embolic TIA. It's like a TIA, but it's not because there's a small embolus coming into the brain. It's because of loss of perfusion. The blood pressure is really not enough. So the motor and sensory symptoms are common, and also it's not. It's very easy to diagnose. If somebody has a motor symptom, it's something that person usually immediately understands. There's also something called limb shaking attacks, which is more unusual, but that's like it's more like an epileptic attack on one side, so a patient like this, or on the other side. And that is often confused with seizures. Seizures might come in, but it's usually later when they already have developed infarctions. But what's also interesting is that there's a major cognitive problem. These patients have decreased mental capacity, the lack of initiative, dementia sometimes, confusion, they can be completely confused. They can develop visual problems, we call it ischemic retinopathy. They have often, I would say always, a feeling of uneasiness. They don't feel well. They can't really explain this, but they don't feel well. And they have these watershed zone infarctions. So there are compensating mechanisms. If you get an occlusion of the internal carotid artery, obviously not everybody will suffer from this problem. So first of all is the circular Willis, and I will just show you the circular Willis. I think it's on the next slide. There are also pial arterial collaterals. Pial arterial collaterals are going over the surface of the brain and connects one arterial territory to another one. They can be very prominent and very strong, and be enough to supply part of the brain, even if the original supply is not there anymore. There are branches from the external carotid artery to the ophthalmic artery collaterals. Blood pressure is a very, very important mechanism. What happens with the blood pressure is that it rises. So these patients often have a high blood pressure. And then what happens is that they go to a general practitioner. General practitioner realizes that they have a high blood pressure, and they get the blood pressure medication, and then they have neurological symptoms because the blood pressure goes down. And then there are endogene mechanisms, arterial dilatation and metabolic adjustments that I won't go into in detail. The circular Willis, I think you all know. It's just that I just would like you to remind you that there are so many variations of the circular Willis. But these patients normally don't have a complete circular Willis. That's very unusual. What they have is a broken circular Willis. It's very typical that they have something like this patient that I just showed you, that had something like this, where you have don't have any posterior communicating arteries, Okay, sorry for the interruption. You have a small, you like like you have here, for example, you have no posterior communicating arteries, and here you have no anterior communicating artery. And if you, of course, if you have a stenosis or an occlusion of the carotid, it becomes symptomatic. If you have a cervical villus that looks like this, where the blood can flow from the basilar artery to the left internal carotid artery, over the anterior part of the cervical villus to the right side, etc., it's much less likely that you will develop symptoms if you get an occlusion in one of these arteries. There are anterior collateral systems, and I will not go into those in detail because I think it's going to be confusing. But what you see here is an injection on the right side, like Michel Mawad showed you yesterday. And here you have the normal flow to the left side, and here you have all the collaterals on the left side that fill all the way down to the middle cerebral artery. These vessels normally fill from this side like this, and this, and this, and this, and this. And here, instead, it goes like this, and in the other direction. If you have collaterals like this, you might line the brain quite well, even if the original supply is not there. In this case, there was an original supply, but it's very tiny, like you can see here. And in this case, there was an occlusion of this is a lateral view. So you have the nose here, you have the back of the head here, here you have the teeth of the patient, and here you have the external carotid anterior branches, and here you have the little stump that is the internal carotid artery. And normally it should be an artery here. It's not filling, but the top of the artery here is filling through the ophthalmic artery. So you have flow from the external carotid artery branches in the face of the patient, into the orbit and back and supply the brain. And all these collaterals, all these systems work together to keep the brain alive. There are different patients and brains, obviously fluctuations in blood pressure and collateral circulation, different thresholds obviously also. That has been shown very nicely in rat experiments. There are perfusion deficit in one part of the brain may also affect other ones, and there are other factors. So, and also motor, speech, and visual and sensory dysfunction is so much easier to diagnose than cognitive impairment. Cognitive impairment is probably, because of hypoperfusion, it's probably severely underdiagnosed. Can we quantify it if we find the patient? There's been some work done with oxygen PET, which is not available here and is not available anywhere except in the experimental setting. And there also you can maybe quantify it a little bit, somewhat quantify it with MR perfusion, and maybe arterial spindling maybe. But there are no reliable relations between hypoperfusion and clinical signs, except if you do positron emission tomography, which is not the case here. So we can't quantify it really. So here we treated a number of patients here. So we have 31 patients, and here you can see the symptoms of this group. As I said, they have fluctuating motor, sensory, etc. Watershed functions in 15 of the patients. This is a male, 61 years old, intermittent visual loss in 6 months, no peripheral visual field loss. This is very common, the visual field it becomes smaller and smaller. Headache, nausea, memory sensory symptoms, intermittent symptoms, left facial palsy. And here you have his perfusion imaging, and this here you have the mean transit time, which is obviously prolonged. Here you have the watershed infarctions, and here you can see that the blood volume here is increased because all these arteries over the convexity has dilated, so they're much bigger than usual. So there's much more blood here than it should be. And the watershed regions, like we discussed previously, are those that are between the different territories. This is typically where you see them. This is what we found as stenosis. There is no posterior communicating arteries that are functional. There's basically no functional anterior communicating artery. So in a case like this, you do an angiogram, and you see, if you look at the middle image first, this is what it looks like after the treatment. You have a stent here. This is before the treatment, and here you can see that the artery is barely visible. There's a little contrast there. So you can, in a case like this, you can easily recanalize the artery. It's not difficult. It's not technically difficult. You go there, like we discussed yesterday, you go there with a catheter, ordinary diagnostic catheter, and a guide wire, and then you can actually recanalize this one. But you have to be very, very careful, because what happens when you recanalize, when you open the artery, and when the hope will take everything in the artery with it, so it will end up in the brain. So if you have anything left there, any embolus left in the artery before when you open the flow, you create a stroke, and that's going to be very difficult to handle. So in this case, we recanalized this one. We didn't have any problems. It's clinically doing well. It doesn't have any symptoms. 5 years follow-up, and he has a stent there. So this is the way you can look also at patients with intracranial stenosis. Some of them have this problem. They don't have an embolic problem. You should try to separate these two entities. This is a female, 61-year-old. You can again see the history. Occlusion of the right internal carotid artery, severe hyperperfusion, right MCA, ischemic lesions on the right side. Again, the same thing here. There, there, there. And in this case, a large area of hyperperfusion. Same thing, I showed you this image before, actually it's the same image. You can see this little area here. Also there's a little contrast there. So again, you can do a recanalization. In this case, it was an artery that had been occluded for a long time. So when we did the recanalization, the artery was small and insignificant like this. And we stented most of the artery extracranially, which is not really necessary. We don't do that anymore. And then you see the increasing flow. And this patient is also had dramatic clinical improvement, but still has had an infarction. I'll show you a third case. It's the last one. Patient with schizophrenia, as you can see, vertigo, intermittent weakness. This is a more complex case. Bilateral internal carotid artery occlusion, limited collateral flow. And this is just to show you that it's difficult to predict the outcome of these patients. It's difficult to say what happens if you don't do anything, or if you do something and it doesn't come out the way you expected. So this patient had a left hemisphere hyperperfusion, and here is the injection into the vertebral artery, and you see here the vertebral artery. This is an anterior view, filling the basilar artery, the posterior circulation, and here you have both the middle cerebral arteries and internal carotid arteries there, and then on the left side, because both these arteries are open, so they are just supplied by these posterior communicating arteries. So again, we decided to go for one side. In this case, it was the left side we decided to recanalize. It wasn't technically difficult. After 6 months, there was a restenosis, and also you can see here the stenosis in another part actually of the tree. So we ballooned this and put a stent there, and everybody was happy. And then 6 months restenosis again. Same thing, but worse. And we left the patient untreated, and now she's doing fine 5 years later. So sometimes it's very difficult to say what's going to happen with these patients. Sometimes they probably stabilize by themselves, but some of them go. Some of them don't do that. They have infarctions and they don't do well at all. So results from short term you see here, it's fluctuated. 26 of them actually improved, 2 were unchanged. 1 reported worsening of symptoms, and 1 progressing infarctions and died, and 4 perfusion hemorrhages, 3 minor and 1 large. The problem here obviously is that these patients have had hypoperfusion for a long time. So when you increase the flow, you have the opposite, you have the hyperperfusion problem. The arteries are wide, and the flow is too vivid, and also so they are prone to hemorrhage. So you need to keep down the blood pressure. You have to reduce the blood pressure, preferably around 120 systolic. About hyperperfusion, can we quantify that? No, we cannot do that. But is the relationship between the measurements and the clinical signs? It's not very good actually. So we use the clinical signs. Once we have the diagnosis, we are guided by the clinical picture. And it's also possible that the symptoms are not only secondary to hypoperfusion, they could also be secondary to embolus or thrombosis or both. So this is a field that is very unclear this far. But we have the patients, we have the problem, and they don't do well unless we treat them. But some recover. And we can't really say today who will recover and who will not be there. So in conclusion, cerebral hyperperfusion can be symptomatic, motor, sensory, visual, speech, seizures, late cognitive symptoms, dementia, ischemia, watershed infarctions, and don't forget the limb shaking syndrome, because it's very typical. And it carries a risk for hemodynamic stroke, and it may be an underestimated cause of neurological decline. In Egypt, obviously, intracranial stenosis is more common than extracranial stenosis, but the same reasoning can apply for intracranial stenosis. If you don't have any collaterals, this could again cause problems. And sometimes, if you have a chronically occluded internal carotid artery, vertical artery, it can be recanalized. And this is where I come from. It's far
we open the floor for discussion.
Jean-Claude Baron from Paris. Thank you for the nice talk. Just to turn the terminology issue and also to make sure there is no confusion in people's minds. Of course, chronic cerebral hypoperfusion exists, and I was, after distal to carotid occlusion stenosis, I was one of the first to show it. But it's not chronic penumbra. I think it's important for people to understand that chronic penumbra does not exist. Beyond 24 hours is essentially nobody has chronic penumbra. What you show is chronic hypoperfusion, which is, as you show in the slide, the decrease of blood flow between normal and the penumbra threshold. So this is what we call oliguemia, and of course it's prone to become symptomatic and penumbral if the perfusion pressure goes down or if you have Ebola. So I just wanted to clarify this.
Thank you very much for clarifying that. It's clear here that we're really talking about the same thing. The problem is that you have hyperconfusion, and once it becomes symptomatic, you change the name, which is okay.
Any more questions?
The sake of terminology, there is hemodynamic TIA. It is equivalent, if we say, in a state of hypoperfusion, hemodynamic. It is synonymous for that. I am in your back, at your back.
I apologize.
The word dynamic, say TIA, hemodynamic state of hypoperfusion to the brain. Is it similar? The meaning is similar.
Hemodynamic.
Say TIA. You present many cases with transient symptomology. As mentioned in the TIA, is it the word hemodynamic TIA? Is it equivalent for hypoperfusion or something else?
It's a bit difficult to say because it's you have a hemodynamic problem, and when the blood pressure varies, you get symptoms. So then it's probably a hemodynamic TIA. But the same patient can obviously also have embolic problems. So this could be a mix. But the terminology hemodynamic TIA is actually quite frequent in the neurological literature that we're choosing. But it is kind of an unclear area.
It is rather transient. The phenomena of hemodynamics rather transient. For example, diarrhea or blood loss or something like this. This is a sort of being dynamic. But hypoperfusion is rather static, it's non-plastic. Yeah.
I want a question for you. Thank you very much. Time extended to 10 hours, depending on what? Imaging only or WINHS?
Can you repeat that?
Extended time window to 10 hours, depending on what? Imaging only or clinical picture or WINHS?
Some of the studies actually have, if you look more closely, they have certain inclusion criteria where they actually stratify according to age, NIH, and the graduation of the mismatch, like in Dawn and Diffuse. So actually, this is true that for some patients, a stratification according to NIH can also be performed. Would make sense, particularly for those patients who are going to be treated with by endovascular recanalization. For the wake-up study, what I just show is just the presence of a relevant deficit, which otherwise would qualify for thrombolytic treatment. But for the endovascular studies, actually, if you look more closely into the inclusion criteria, a stratification according to NIH can be performed.
Thank you. The next speaker is Professor Peter Schellinger, Professor of Neurology and Neurogeriatrics, Chairman of the Department of Neurology and Neurogeriatrics at the Clinical Center Johannes Wessling in München, Germany. He is a member of the medical faculty. faculties of the universities in Erlangen and Heidelberg, and he received his medical treatment at Technical University of Aachen. Thrombolysis is still the gold standard for stroke therapy.
Now it's on. Okay, thank you very much. Dear colleagues, dear chairwoman, dear chairman, first of all, I would like to congratulate you on the first Egyptian National Stroke Conference on behalf of the ESO and also ANGELS, where I'm an executive committee and board of directors member of both societies or organizations. I think you live in a very exciting time, and I remember the time 20 years ago in Germany. There was so much happening, so much to do, and I envy you a little bit that you are now in a situation where you can really drive things forward. So congratulations to you all. The topic of my talk, I was asked to be very critical and very clear in terms or in the face of the discussion that many interventionists suggest that now that endovascular therapy is available, IV thrombolysis is not important anymore, and I happen to very extremely strongly disagree. Ask yourselves, if you have a duel with a really deadly disease, would you rather have 1 or 2 loaded guns in your belt? I think the answer is clear. These are my conflicts of interest. I can assure you that no company ever reached my personal level of corruption. So everything I tell you is my belief and my conviction. And also I have to disclose that my kind of humor is loud, and it's not very modest and laid back like this guy with the handbag. I hope you can bear with me. A talk also has to be sort of entertaining. So don't take everything too serious. Nothing is meant as an insult, just for clarification reasons. Stroke is a very dynamic process, and you have a chance for a very effective treatment. And effective doesn't mean efficient. Endovascular treatment is effective, but you can apply it only to a small number of stroke patients. IV TPA is efficient because you can cover about 1/3 of your stroke patients if you want to. So stroke starts as a small kitchen fire, and very soon, within minutes or within hours, it's burning down the house. And that is why I'm telling you, if you have this deadly opponent or several opponents, even ego shooter games illustrate that. If you want to address the bad guy, 2 guns are better than 1 gun. And I believe that thrombectomy is nothing without IV thrombolysis in the set of stroke management overall, and neither treatment alone can really handle the problems we have ahead. So that is the problem actually. You have an M1 occlusion, in that case a distal occlusion, and then, and these pictures were already shown, the time starts, the clock starts, and over time the small infarct core will grow into a large infarction with a supposedly worse outcome or even death. And you have 3 options what you can do. You can do nothing. If you do nothing, the infarct will grow and the patient will get worse. But you can also act, and in fact you have those 2 loaded guns. You act with IV thrombolysis, plus if there is a large vessel occlusion, endovascular treatment. And at the end, what may happen is that your infarct can stay small, the core doesn't grow, and you have a better chance for independent life and also survival. These are my take-home messages for you. IV TPA is the standard of care, the gold standard, in a 4.5-hour time window with a dose of 0.9 milligrams. That has been shown over and over again. It is even safe and moderately effective outside the label, the European label, which is also the Egyptian label, as I've been informed. We have randomized trials for that. So off-label therapy is allowed in some situations, even encouraged and recommended in guidelines, even if it's not according to the label. Bear in mind, there are no data to support the use of other thrombolytics, neither streptokinase, nor urokinase, desmodulase, and especially not tenecteplase, which has been promoted in some areas on this planet. All randomized trials, and I'm just pointing out the MRS shift endpoint, showed, with the exception of a late and poorly performed trial, Atlantis B, a significance in terms of benefit for intravenous thrombolysis. This is how the world map looks now. And as you can see, there are the countries where the European label is used. There are those, at least to my knowledge now, where there is application for the European label, and there are those backward countries like USA, Canada, Moldavia, and Croatia who still have a 3-hour time window. So also in Egypt, you are far more advanced than those so-called high-tech, high-income countries. This is how the pooled analysis looks like. It tells you, yes, there is a loss of effect over time, but still up to 4.5 hours it's significant. Age doesn't make a difference. If at all, the point estimate for patients older than 80 is better in favor of alteplase than not giving it. And talking about later on the severe strokes, you can see here, if at all, the effect, the point estimate in more severe strokes, and stroke patients with NIH scores over 10 usually have a large vessel occlusion. What most people won't know, and I by accident got that information, and the company doesn't even tell it to us, the EMA label changed in terms of age. In June 2018, the European agency approved TPA for all ages, including patients under 18, age 16 and 17. So nearly 1/3 of the patients that we treat in Europe over 80 are now in label and not off label. The oldest patient I personally have treated was a 103-year-old lady, and she didn't bleed. She didn't improve, but she didn't bleed. A few basic things, and that is, I think, your job to tell your residents. CT-based intravenous thrombolysis is easy. You just need to think about a few things. You may even break the rules of label. And your target must be a global implementation. The current IV rate is less than 10% of all stroke patients, sometimes as low as 1%. It can be up to 1/3, and in large comprehensive stroke centers, these numbers that every 4th or every 3rd of our stroke patients is getting TPA have been achieved. In my center, it's 24% right now. Hospitals, and that is something that you also have to be very, very strict about. Hospitals without a stroke and without a thrombolysis program should not accept patients with acute stroke, nor have them admitted, nor should they be reimbursed for treating stroke patients. And finally, all studies and pooled data confirm the effect of time. The more time passes, the less your chance for a good recovery. So I want to lose a word on logistics for IV treatment. I think you should adopt a military approach to it. That is a quote from an old movie, Apocalypse Now. A young actor at that time, Robert Duvall, as Colonel Kilgore. And Michael Hill from Calgary in the late 90s, when I was visiting, did rounds and gave 3 RTPAs on a weekend call, which was a large number at that time. And he came to the morning round and he did this. I love the smell of TPA in the morning. It smells like victory. That's the attitude. That's the spirit. That's what you have to do. And you can tell your residents, it's easy to do it. It's a therapeutic standard. It's evidence-based class 1A. It's easy, quick, and dirty. You can achieve door-to-needle times of a median 30 minutes, even all of the patients below 30 minutes. And you don't need much for that. You need a doctor. It can be a resident. It doesn't even have to be a very gifted resident, just a doctor. You need point-of-care labs, a CT, nowadays with large vessel occlusion being treated by endovascular treatment on top. You also need a CT angiography, and you need the drug. I told my residents, you can train a chimpanzee to give IV thrombolysis. Obviously, they were very angry with me because they thought I would call them apes. One of my attendings was so nice to supply me with another example to illustrate that IV treatment is very easy. The archer fish. The archer fish kills flying insects with a water jet they spit out, as you can see on the right image. They are able to recognize and differentiate faces in black-white, like a normal CT and a bleeding on the CT, and spit shoot with an 86% hit quote. They don't even have a neocortex. They don't have a telencephalon. If they can do it, our residents can do it as well. The most important publication in the last 10 years in terms of logistics is Atamir Toya's paper with the 12 measures to reduce treatment delays. And I have that as a big poster translated in my neuro ER. And the most important things are relocate the CT scanner to the emergency room, deliver TPA on the table, use point-of-care labs, and reduce your imaging to the utterly necessary. In clear words, cut out all the bullshit of your stroke protocol. Be fast, do it within 15 to 30 minutes, and don't think too much about it. By cutting out all that crap from your protocols, you can reduce your door-to-needle times 7 years ago to a median of 20 minutes. In Erlangen, we replicated that when I was still working there with Martin Körmann together, and we checked the acute stroke patient in the ER with the emergency nurse and a stroke physician. In parallel, directly moving the patient to the CT, we do the immediate reading of the CT and then decide whether to treat or not and start thrombolysis in the CT scanner. That is what cuts down door-to-needle time very effectively and efficiently. And what you can do by that, by cutting down the protocol, you standardize and harmonize it, meaning it doesn't really make a difference whether the patient is coming on the weekend or not, during night hours or not, or in the golden hour where time yields, where you're in a short time when you don't have the biggest treatment effect that you can expect. It doesn't make a difference if you cut down your protocol. And that is what happens when you standardize it. This is from Get With The Guidelines, the US. You see the onset to door time. Those patients who get in very, very early after stroke onset, the physician thinks, oh, it's 30 minutes, I still have 4 hours time to treat the patient. Wrong. You have to do it right away. And if you cut out all this stuff and standardize it and streamline it, the effect is that you don't have this curve, but you have a nearly parallel curve. This is the graph from our study in Erlangen. And when I give those talks, people come to me and say, Peter, what about lawsuits? And I tell them, I work a lot for German courts as an expert witness. And I'm not working for either plaintiff or the suit party. And I have in the last 10 years, and I'm not lying, not seen a single case where a physician has been found guilty or even accused for a bleeding happening when the patient was treated with IV thrombolysis. I have seen hundreds of cases where the doctors were sued because of not giving IV thrombolysis, and in the recent years because of not thinking about endovascular therapy. Medico-legally speaking, you are much safer if you treat rather than not treating. So, to use heavy metal language, hell yes, logistics for IV thrombolysis are easy. Now addressing endovascular therapy, and I don't want to go into too much detail because Jean-Claude Baron is going to talk about that. I just want to make a few points why effective doesn't mean efficient necessarily. For how many patients do you want to offer this highly effective, large treatment effect therapy? That are data from Erlangen, 1,000 patients with acute ischemic stroke in that center per year, excluding TIAs and hemorrhages. And about 25% of those get IV TPA, and 50 were treated with endovascular treatment. That means the absolute number is 5%. In many centers it's below 1%. In the best centers it's up to 10%, and those centers get patients from all over the place. And if you look at that, is it worth the cost and infrastructure? To a certain extent, yes. But this is not the first priority. The first priority is to ensure that every patient who's eligible gets intravenous thrombolysis. 5% of stroke patients, Extend IA, one of the big 5 trials, they gave thrombectomy to only 0.7% of their screened patients, and many of the patients didn't even make it into the screening log. To use that example from history, Leonidas with his 300 Spartans against the 100,000 Persians and the Thermopylians, he recognized and had to pay with his life for that manpower can be a real problem, especially the lack thereof. So if you have one interventionalist, and there are not many of them, We need to really, they need to train more and more. You need, for a full 24/7, 365 days a year service, you need 4 to 5 of them. If you have one, the patient is in the angio suite, and the interventionalist is on vacation, gone fishing. Nothing happens. And if this patient didn't get TPA, then he has gotten nothing. And that is bad. And in my country, you get sued for that. So there could be reasons, as you see here, why TPA should be withheld in thrombectomy patients. Increased bleeding risk. None of the available data, which are indirect comparisons, suggest an increased bleeding risk. Angioedema, I have seen that I see that once a year. It's irrelevant. Contraindication for heparin and antiplatelet use if you need stenting. If you need stenting in a tandem occlusion, the patient is very, very bad prognostically off anyway. So if there is TPA on board, I couldn't care less if I have to give additional aspirin. Delay in mechanical thrombectomy. We are so fast that there must not be a delay. There cannot be a delay for the interventionalist. Mostly, the intervention is delayed because the interventionalist is late, not because we are late or we protract the time with IV thrombolysis. We give it on the CT scanner. We give it in between non-contrast CT and CT angiography. We give the bolus. Increased cost. Okay, it's an issue. 500 euros, the shot TPA, compared to a chance of lifetime disability. Do you get lifetime nursing for 500 euros in Egypt? In Germany you don't. It's about 30,000 euros a year. So comparing the cost, it's peanuts. And there are many reasons for giving IV thrombolysis before thrombectomy. Improvement in collateral circulation. Reperfusion of distal occlusions where you can put a catheter to. Thrombus softening, leading to less passes with the device that you have to do. Prompt treatment initiation, lack of time loss. You may reduce the likelihood of an infarct in new territories by the intervention itself, which has actually been shown in the ESCAPE trial. And you may even avert the need for mechanical thrombectomy because you achieve recanalization by IV TPA alone. And the view from the interventionalist, and I took Swiss as an example, is very narrowed and focused, and then the Swiss interventionalist thinks a direct kill by a headshot is superior to slow torture with RTPA followed by hanging. To continue with the Swiss example, I think softening the clot with a cheese fondue and then following up with a Swiss Army knife might be the better approach. I have an example from Martin Körmann in Essen, a colleague of mine, and the chief interventionalist, Isabel Warnke, was in house. That patient came in, and she said to him, "Man, why do you want to give TPA? In 15 minutes I'm up there and the clot is out, the left MCA occlusion." And Martin said, which I will do the same, "Well, I'm going to start my TPA and then you do what you have to do." And so it started. And if you take a closer look at the anatomy, you see that the common carotid trunk doesn't really make it easy to get the catheter around the curves. And it was, again, the chief attending and the most experienced interventionalist at that time. It took her 1.5 hours to enter the internal carotid artery. And after she entered, she then saw that. But if you looked more distally, you saw that IV treatment already had recanalized the clot. That patient would have been a futile transport or was a futile thrombectomy. And if you had withheld TPA, you would have done nothing and harmed the patient. So, and then I read in some of the papers that interventional therapy is better than medical therapy. No, interventional therapy on top of IV thrombolysis is superior to IV thrombolysis alone. It's on top, it's not instead of. And in all trials, in some it was mandatory to get RTPA. Overall, in the pooled analysis, 90% of patients got TPA. And there was a substantial number in these trials where intervention was not necessary anymore because IV TPA had already caused recanalization, and this does only include the patients in the screening logs, and many of the screening logs are not filled out. If you look at this, it's small, but you can see that we are dealing with approximately 90% of the patients in the trials who have distal internal carotid or proximal M1 occlusions. And we are dealing with a set of data where 90% of the patients got IV TPA. So there are no good data to compare direct thrombectomy with IV thrombolysis plus thrombectomy. It's all indirect comparisons. And then I see that in a paper and I get so angry. The substantial improvement in 3-month functional outcomes in patients with large vessel occlusion treated with thrombectomy, combined with a poor response of proximal occlusions to intravenous. I stopped reading after that, and I just could tell it's unbelievable bullshit. Forget that. Looking at this, and the intervention, some of them, not all, say IV therapy is completely useless in proximal occlusions. But look at this. These are the patients with proximal occlusions. Autoplase is, even if at all, getting more effective than non-effective in patients with severe strokes. And IVT does not work in large vessel occlusion. Look at the IMS3 trial. M1 occlusions. Recanalization 85 versus 67%, but the outcome rates are nearly the same. Just look at them. 70% recanalizations. And if you go on and take a look at Mr. Clean, don't worry, I cannot read it either. But what it says here is, if there is a poor response to TPA, or too late for TPA, then you should randomize. And this tells you that in the first randomized trial, there were only patients that were TPA failures. So this is a subselection of patients, and this explains you the following slide I'm going to show you. Randomization only of patients that did not respond to IVT. It was rescue approach. This is comparing apples with pears. If you look at this, this is IMS, intravenous alone versus endovascular on top. This is MR, this is Mr. Clean. And you see that the control arm, IV TPA alone, performs in IMS3 better than the intervention arm of Mr. Clean. And after that trial, the study was stopped. So the IVT arm of IMS3 is better than the thrombectomy arm of Mr. Clean, which is the basis of now having thrombectomy approved and in the guidelines. Think of that. So if you look at meta-analyses that compare indirectly data of direct mechanical thrombectomy versus bridging therapy, I will start with a few pictures to drive that point home. It's not a talk I give against thrombectomy. I love thrombectomy. But it is a talk trying to bring over the message that IV TPA is the gold standard of care, and you can give it to 1/3 of your stroke patients, up to 1/3. So what's better than one machine gun? 2 machine guns. And we can go throughout movie history in Hollywood. Even Humphrey Bogart in the 50s of the last century knew that. Clint Eastwood in the 70s. And actually, he not only has 2 guns, but if you look, he has 4 guns. Look at Nicolas Cage in Face Off, 2 guns. Look at Keanu Reeves in The Matrix, 2 guns. And look at The Equalizer, Denzel Washington, 2 guns are better than 1. This is a fact. Even here in a movie that's called 2 Guns, or Christian Bale in Equilibrium, 2 guns. So, again, coming to the reasons why you could think about withholding IV treatment, despite the theoretical concern of a higher bleeding risk with IVT pre-treatment. This has never been shown in any trial, and I'm going to show you the data on indirect comparisons. You have to know that there are substantial discrepancies in studies comparing clinical outcomes between direct mechanical thrombectomy and bridging therapy. Look at this. This is from the Hermes collaboration, and if you compare the patients in there They were not randomized for that, but in there. With regard to disability, it favors, non-significantly, but favors bridging treatment with an odds ratio of 1.3 and a p-value that is a trend. For mortality, it significantly favors bridging therapy to reduce mortality by half, number needed to treat of 2. If you look at observational series, you see again a trend for significance favoring combined treatment with an odds ratio of 1.3, just barely missing significance. For mortality and above that, symptomatic hemorrhage. Symptomatic hemorrhage, observational series, no difference. Mortality, again, as you can see here, a statistical trend at least. These are only the observational data, not the randomized trials. So, softer endpoints, successful recanalization is significantly higher in the observational series if you have IV-TPA on board. And new territory infarctions, which are an independent predictor of a worse outcome, new territory infarctions caused by the intervention can happen, we know that. As you can see in the ESCAPE trial, the odds for new territory infarctions were reduced by 70% relative. That's statistically significant. If you have TPA on board, some things that get loosened up are treated as a side effect. This is the latest meta-analysis. Again, whatever meta-analysis you use, you see from the randomized and the observational data, you see that it trend-wise or significantly favors the bridging approach. Absolute benefit, 5%, absolute. If you look at death, the same story, you see a significant reduction when you bridge as opposed to direct thrombectomy. No? It doesn't continue, yeah. Okay, risk reduction, significant for mortality. And if you look at symptomatic hemorrhage, again, you see it is neutral, the risk is not increased. If you look at successful recanalization, you see a significant, you see a trend, and if you look at number of device classes, you see a significant advantage in favor of bridging treatment. And now I come to the last point, futile transfers. Resistance is futile. We know that from the Borg and Star Trek. Futile transfers, what does that mean? The patient comes to the primary stroke center, is treated with IV-TPA, and then referred to the comprehensive stroke center for endovascular treatment. And these are the studies, and they are all pretty new. And you see that the number of futile transfers, the patient is transferred but doesn't get thrombectomy, is on average around 50%. Every second patient transferred for thrombectomy doesn't need thrombectomy or cannot get thrombectomy. Why? In the Fuentes trial, half of them because they were recanalized by IV treatment, and another third because the infarct had already progressed and it couldn't be treated anymore, or because of clinical impairment or transfer delay. In Sablot's work, it's exactly the same, or nearly the same, 60% improvement with arterial recanalization, and 1 out of 6 patients because of worsening and infarct growth. So the take-home message to that is, taking into account the existing literature, IVT and mechanical thrombectomy are 2 highly effective and complementary reperfusion therapies. And all ischemic stroke patients with who have no contraindications should receive the bolus promptly. In conclusion, IV-TPA is a mandatory standard of care, always comes first, 1/3 of all strokes, and applies to 90% of the early thrombectomies. There are 2 effective therapies which should be combined. IV-TPA should not delay thrombectomy, but rapid delivery of endovascular therapy should not be used as an excuse to deny intravenous thrombolysis. Final slide. We also can use Far East mentality to explain it. He will win who knows how to handle both superior and, if you want to call it that, then inferior forces in a battle. When in a fight to the death, one wants to employ all one's weapons to the utmost. Miyamoto Musashi, a famous sword fighter in ancient Japan. And you should not have a favorite weapon. To become over-familiar with one weapon is as bad as not knowing it sufficiently well. So, drip and ship is the answer to this dilemma. Thank you.
Thanks, Professor Peter Schneider. The floor is open for questions.
Thank you very much for your very impressive presentation. I highly appreciate your great knowledge of movie history. However, I believe that your approach is slightly biased. One thing that you kept forgetting during your analysis is that every single patient who has been treated by thrombectomy within the randomized trials were not given IVTPA because of contraindication. The contraindication in the majority of the cases was not identified. So those patients, that you said you should not compare apple with pears, but actually we all do, unless we do randomized comparative trial between bridging and thrombectomy without bridging. Because until now, even observational or randomized, all patients not treated with bridging are not treated because IVTPA is contraindicated. Otherwise, we will go against the valid guidelines.
We are on the same page. I was asked to give a very pointed, I'm not biased, I was pointed, message, because there are voices out there saying that IVTPA should not be given even if indicated. And as you said, I completely agree with you. If it's indicated, you have to give it. It's a standard, it's a guideline. And if we are not talking dawn and diffuse, the effect in the super selected patients in the late time window is so big because actually the control group has nothing. They are not eligible for TPA anymore. But if you look at the time window of the early thrombectomy trials, as I showed you, 90% of them have TPA on board. So that is a joint therapeutic approach. And unless the randomized trials, which are ongoing, such as Swift Direct, at the mothership compare IVTPA plus endovascular versus endovascular alone. When these trials show superiority for thrombectomy alone, then you could leave out IVTPA. If they only show non-inferiority, for non-inferiority you cannot leave out or violate standard of care. I am not saying that an early time window patient, let's say 3 hours, on full anticoagulation, INR of 3.0 on Coumadin, should be treated with IV thrombolysis. This is an example of the 10% of patients in the randomized trials in the early time window who were not bridged. But I'm saying that as of now, it is a team. It's IVT plus thrombectomy, unless proven otherwise.
Thank you very much. However, I am afraid that the way you presented looked very much like there was no team,
and I was fighting against the endovascular. This is what I wanted to point out, and I appreciate that at least by the end, in response to my comment, you mentioned the randomized trial that is supposed to shed the light on that open question, which is an open question today. Thank you very much.
Of course. And to state that I have never in my talk said that I'm against thrombectomy. I'm pointing out that thrombectomy does not mean, or the availability of thrombectomy, that you can omit a gold standard of care. And that is what is currently discussed, and in some countries that is practiced. And in my country, that is medical legal malpractice.
Now we have the opportunity to welcome Professor Dr. Jean Flower Baron, Director of Research and Deputy Director of INSERM Paris, Descartes University Research Center for Psychiatry and Neuroscience, honorary neurology consultant at Saint-Anne Hospital in Paris, France, trained in clinical neurology at Solitaire Hospital Paris, trained in functional brain imaging at Harvard University, trained in medical physics at the Atomic Energy Commission, Orsay, France. And he will speak about if there are role for thrombolysis in thrombectomy era. Welcome.
Thank you, the organizers, for inviting me to give this talk. So, as you see, first I want to acknowledge the work of my PhD student, Pierre Semers, who's contributed to this talk. So, the answer is yes. There is still a place for thrombolysis in the thrombectomy era. Different from Peter Schellinger, I will talk only of patients with large vessel occlusion within the 4.5 hours window. So as you know, the guidelines, the current guidelines is that patients who are eligible for IV alteplase should receive IV alteplase even if endovascular therapy is being considered. So that's the guideline, and we all agree, and Peter Schellinger also concurred with that. Just want to mention that in the current recommendations, there is no guideline regarding treatment paradigm, mothership or dripmanship. People do what they think is reasonable. The ambulance take the patients where they think it's the best interest. So, despite these recommendations, these guidelines, there are still people that argue about the usefulness of IV thrombolysis. Is IV thrombolysis futile? And indeed, there are some observational studies that suggest no benefit from IV thrombolysis over thrombectomy alone. You have the list here. But there are also recent observational studies that suggest superiority of bridging over thrombectomy alone. So it is, there's an equipoise. And it's, in addition, only observational studies, not randomized studies, so they could have a selection bias. And there are ongoing randomized clinical trials testing bridging versus thrombectomy alone in unselected LVO populations, Swift-Run direct, MR3, no IV, mainly. And there are other reasons for people who claim that thrombolysis is futile, that it can delay thrombectomy in mothership, potential complications we heard from Peter Schellinger, the cost as well. But their main rationale, the people who claim that thrombolysis should not be carried out, is that it does not provide sufficient rate of early recanalization. And actually, Peter Schellinger showed a slide from Steve Gullis' review that showed in the table that he showed there was 10% early recanalization. And this is not, as I will show, is not true, at least with drip and ship paradigm. So, yes, this paper, Coutinho et al., says that in big trials, ESCAPE, Rivascal, Swift Prime, Mr. Clean, the early recanalization rate was less than 10%. If this is true, then yes, maybe it's useless to give thrombolysis. However, as we wrote in a letter to the editor of JAMA Neurology, these trials that Coutinho et al. Quoted, in fact, they carried out vascular imaging after, not before. And they recruited patients after this re-imaging. Therefore, early recanalization was markedly underestimated, especially for drip and ship patients. Of course, if you study recanalization at 24, 48 hours, you also find that TPA does provide a large rate of recanalization, up to 75%. But this should not be considered because here you have very late recanalizations which are completely futile. So the question is really, what is the early recanalization rate in LVO patients, large vessel occlusion, within 4.5 hours treated with TPA? And very few studies have in fact addressed this key point. So we carried out a systematic review and meta-analysis, which was published in Stroke. And in that study, we considered early recanalization as within 3 hours after start of IV therapy. This is to account for the drip and ship paradigm. There was 26 studies, around 2,000 patients, and complete recanalization within 3 hours was 20%, not 10% or 5%. So this is really substantial. Of course, there are differences according to the site. We all know that proximal occlusions of the carotid have very low rate of recanalization. M1 around 20% and M2 around 40%. So there is a site effect. The limitation of that meta-analysis was that most included studies were patients before the endovascular therapy era, so there was selection bias. So we conducted a new study that has just been published in Stroke on this issue. So this is a retrospective analysis of prospectively gathered registries. Inclusion criteria were LVO stroke is thrombolized before referral for thrombectomy. 2 cohorts, the derivation cohort of 633 patients, validation cohort 474 patients, and this is really a typical bridging therapy case mix. Particularly, you see 60% of drip and ship patients, which is the average international sort of value. 40% proximal M1, which is typical, and the delay from the start of thrombolysis to angiography was around 90 to 100 minutes. We assessed recanalization occurring within 3 hours from IVT start and defined as LTP to be 3. And we got around, again, 20% in both cohorts, confirming our meta-analysis. So it is substantial.
It's not 10%, not 5%, it's 20%. 1 in 5 patients will recanalize within 3 hours after IVTPA. And in fact, it's consistent with 3 studies that have been very recently published that are listed here, so it is, reproduced. This means that skipping IVT is a lost opportunity for 20% of LVO patients. It's straightforward first-line therapy, even in the mothership situation. And there's no significant increase in symptomatic ICH. So why should you skip it? There's absolutely no reason. And we know from Peter Schellinger's talk that there can be benefits from that in terms of distal occlusions, even the no reflow phenomenon, and faster thrombectomy. Now the question is, can we predict recanalization in individual patients? Because this is 20% is the average. But now for randomized trials, or when you do your clinical work, maybe you want to know for this particular patient, what is the probability of recanalization. So this is towards randomized controlled trials in selected populations and also towards personalized medicine. Can we predict which patients will recanalize early following thrombolysis? And the implication here is futile transfers. If you know a patient is going to recanalize within 1-2 hours, maybe you should not transfer the patient to another hospital for thrombectomy. And conversely, which patients will be resistant to IV thrombolysis, which is then futile thrombolysis. And the implication of this particular patient, you know, is not going to recanalize, therefore, after thrombolysis, therefore, you should skip thrombolysis and save time. And maybe this will also be useful for trials on more efficient IV therapies. So the whole topic is how to select patients for improved randomized trials, where you include only patients who are really the question, the scientific question. So if we go back to our systematic review, you need to define predictors. Proximal artery occlusion across those studies was a predictor, and NIHSS. However, many predictors would not be assessed in that meta-analysis because there were less than 4 studies, and of them poor collaterals and long thrombus and others I will talk about now. So in that same paper that is just published, we studied the predictors of recanalization after thrombectomy. We assess the clinical variable, the time elapsed after IVT, imaging variables. Our population in France, MRI is recommended as first-line imaging, so 92% of our cohorts had MRI. Occlusion site, the size of the diffusion lesion, and the susceptibility vessel sign and T2 star imaging, which is an image of the thrombus. So presence and length of the thrombus. Just for your information, so these are beautiful SDS, susceptibility vessel sign, and we just measured, according to a published method, the length of the thrombus. And we found on multivariable analysis that indeed thrombus length is extremely powerful in predicting early recanalization after thrombectomy. You can see here the data, and you see this is extremely clear. Less than 5 millimeters, you have like 85% probability of recanalization, and this drops dramatically, And beyond 10 millimeter of thrombus length, you have essentially no recanalization. See, with 20 millimeters, it's essentially zero. So it's extremely strong relationship. Now the time, which we analyze in terms of the paradigm, drip and ship versus mothership, and this is also highly significant. This is not surprising. The more you wait until you do the angiogram for the thrombectomy, and the more likely the recanalization after thrombolysis. And you have here the rates. So for drip and ship, you see it's around 25% in our 2 cohorts. So it's not negligible at all. 1 in 4 patients will recanalize before thrombectomy. And in the mothership, it's around 10%. So indeed, mothership has very short time between thrombolysis and thrombectomy, and this makes the chance of recanalization much smaller. So this is the actual percent of recanalization according to time, and you see it grows up to about 90 to 120 minutes. This is the TPA infusion, it's 1 hour, as you know, and mothership and drip and ship are here shown with the duration. And if we used the actual time rather than the paradigm, it was also highly significant. Now, occlusion site, this is not surprising, was also highly significant, a bit less. And you see here the percentage of recanalization which are as expected. So from there, we derived a clinical radiological score to estimate the individual probability of early recanalization following IV thrombolysis. This was intended for clinical practice, but mainly for randomized controlled trials in LVO stroke. So this is 3 items. With the 3 items I showed you, 6-point score, thrombus length, occlusion site, drip and ship mothership paradigm. And we give points to this according to the weight in the multivariable analysis. And here are the results. So as you see, the higher the points for this score, which we call FIRE 6, the higher the chance of no recanalization. So as you can see, with the lowest scores, even the lowest score of 0, we still have a 20% chance of recanalization. So this is not very good, because it means 20% is too high chance of no recanalization to withhold transferring the patient. However, with high grades, we have nearly 100% prediction of no recanalization. So these patients could be used in randomized trials testing thrombolysis alone versus bridging to select patients who are really the candidates for this trial, i.e. patients who will not recanalize with thrombolysis, or very unlikely. These are 2 examples. So this is a patient, as you can see here, with an M1 occlusion, and the clot is very small. This is a drip and ship patient. The probability of recanalization is about 80%. So maybe you can withhold transfer, and indeed this patient was transferred and had recanalized. And this is another patient with also an M1 occlusion, but this time the thrombus is 19 millimeter. The score on the FIRE 6 scale is 6, which is the maximum. Chance of recanalization only 2%, and indeed this patient did not recanalize. So you could test thrombectomy alone in this sort of patients. Of course, that study had limitations. MRI is not the most widely available technique worldwide. In France it is. MRIs can be contraindicated, of course, or not visible. the SVS sign is not always visible. It was 85% in our cohort. And therefore we decided to assess the predictors and a score in the entire population, but not considering the SVS, and also including patients who had CT instead of MRI. So this is 631 patients. And we devised the prediction score. So here again we had occlusion site. Of course we don't have thrombus length, sorry. But we have the NIHSS that comes back and the paradigm. And if we create a score without MRI, if you want, again we have no good no value of the low grades of the score, but again the high grades are very, very predictive of no recanalization. So this score could be used for trials testing MT alone versus bridging in situations where MRI is not available. So we get back to that table, and we couldn't include collaterals in the previous analysis because only a fraction of patients had assessment of collaterals. But then we did have 224 patients who had perfusion-weighted imaging out of our 2 cohorts, and we used key metals method derived on the perfusion-weighted imaging to grade collaterals. And these are mainly mothership patients. This is the technique that you know probably of perfusion-weighted imaging. So you have a sequence of gadolinium, and you can select based on that method key metal, intermediate, early phase, and late phase. And from that you can have 4 grades of collaterals, and you can see the collaterals here like spaghettis, yes, and you can grade them from very poor, where you see no spaghettis, up to excellent, where you see them very early. And those grades are well correlated with the digital subtraction angiography collateral grade. And if we do that, we see on multivariable logistic regression that collateral grade is significant, an independent predictor of early recanalization post-thrombectomy, post-thrombolysis. So this means good, excellent collaterality independently predicts early post-IVT recanalization. And why could this be? Maybe because it reflects a better TPA access to the distal end of the thrombus, according to Bang et al. This was just a hypothesis at the time. When you give the alteplase, it reaches, of course, the proximal end of the thrombus, but if you have good collaterals, the alteplase can also attack the distal end of the thrombus. So good collaterals facilitate thrombolysis. Of course, this was using this complicated grading method. You can also use just the perfusion imaging to derive the hypoperfusion intensity ratio, which is Tmax, the volume of Tmax greater than 10 seconds over the Tmax greater than 6 seconds, which is the penumbra. And we know this HIR is well correlated to collateral grade, and it makes a lot of sense. When you have poor collaterals, your area with very low blood flow will be relatively larger inside the MCA territory than if you have good collateral. So this makes a lot of sense. And indeed, Olivo showed that the smaller the smaller the HIR, the greater the growth of infarction. So there are two examples. This is a patient with a small HIR, you see, areas with Tmax, long Tmax occupy only a small portion of the whole Tmax greater than 6 second volume, and this is a patient with a very high HIR. Almost all his hypoperfused area is severely hypoperfused. And we showed, this is a paper that's in revision in stroke. We showed a very good correlation between the hypoperfusion intensity ratio and the collateral grade that I showed you before. And we found indeed that the HIR is an independent predictor of early recanalization. So it's a good substitute to collateral grade to predict post-thrombolysis early recanalization. Now, just a few words about stroke with minor deficits, which, as you know, are not part of the trials of bridging. So NIHSS equal or less than 5 with large vessel occlusion. So we know that thrombolysis is indicated in these patients if they have disabling symptoms. The main rationale is to prevent early neurological deterioration, which can be very without TPA. But we know that persistent occlusion after thrombolysis, and we know the risk of deterioration in TPA-treated minor stroke is still very high. About 1 patient in 10 will deteriorate. So the question is, should you do thrombectomy in addition to thrombolysis in patients with minor deficit and LVO? The current recommendation, 2018, states that it may be reasonable to do thrombectomy. And there are trials that have started or about to start to test bridging versus thrombolysis alone in minor stroke. However, the feasibility is unclear because these patients are not so frequent. So we looked at this problem in our cohort, and we had 97 patients with minor stroke, and early recanalization was 34% because there was a lot of M2 occlusions in this population, and we did find that thrombus length was independently associated with lack of recanalization. This paper is impressive in stroke. So even in minor stroke, thrombus length is a major predictor of recanalization after thrombolysis. So this may mean that maybe you need to screen patients with thrombus length greater than 9 millimeters for inclusion in randomized trials. And finally, I just want to say a few words about the novel approaches to thrombolysis beyond just alteplase. So we heard about tenecteplase already, but there are many new approaches like using DNA, ACE on top of TPA to enhance the effect of TPA or N-acetylcysteine or ADAMT13. Somothrombolysis, as you know, benefit is not documented, and new thrombolytics, desmoteplase, but benefits not documented so far, and tenecteplase, we heard about it earlier today, is a very interesting new approach to thrombolysis. I have no time to go through all the trials that have been done, only to say that in all these studies, early recanalization was done at 24 hours or 48 hours, which is far too late to determine the usefulness of tenecteplase. In these studies was done at 2 hours, but this was not a randomized trial, and it's only published as abstract. So we know the Extend IATN case study that showed a twofold higher rate of early recanalization with tenecteplase, 22% versus 10%. This was in mothership, mainly mothership patients, which explains the low rate of recanalization with altiplase. So we wondered whether tenecteplase also induced early higher recanalization rate, but in drip and chip patients, which much longer delays. So this is a study that's published or in press in Journal of Stroke, and we compared, this is a retrospective observational study only, patients who had tenecteplase versus with drip and chip only, and to altiplase with drip and chip only from our cohorts. And we compared the groups using propensity score matching, and we found no difference, slightly higher recanalization with tenecteplase as compared to altiplase, but not significantly. So, but if you plot, so this is extend IATNK, this is tenecteplase bolus and tenecteplase infusion. If you plot our study, which takes where recanalization is assessed much later than extend IATNK, and you draw lines, you see that what TNK does probably is it provides earlier recanalization, not larger recanalization at 3 hours, but earlier recanalization, making TNK tenecteplase of extremely high interest for thrombolysis in stroke for the future. So I have my conclusion slide has been taken off, but I hope you have the message that early recanalization rate after thrombolysis is substantial, is around 20% in LVO strokes and should not be skipped. It should be given, although for future trials we may want to predict individual recanalization rate in order to improve the design of those trials. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. King. I will open the floor for discussion.
Well, fantastic data, fantastic talk. Thank you very much, and mostly in line with what I think. That's also nice. But I would like to make one comment. It's one thing testing hypotheses and therefore withholding in an informed consent-based randomized trial to test a hypothesis, the standard of care. Just talking numbers, if you say that according to your FIRE score, for instance, a given patient has a recanalization rate chance of 5%. This is very low because we vascular neurologists are used to higher numbers, but compare these 5% to the numbers in primary PCI trials. Cardiologists perform PCI with stenting in their primary heart attack victims, and they base their heart centers on the success of an absolute 4% reduction of death and recurrent MI. So 5% chance of recanalization, even if it's low, is good enough for me to take TPA.
Yeah, my argument is mainly to have this information in order to design trials. It's not for everyday practice. It may be one day, it's possible, but we need the randomized trials, and maybe one way to improve the recruitment rate and also to enrich in the patients who are really the target of the trial. I think our studies could be useful for that.
I would like to thank you for and congratulate you this very scientific and very well-balanced presentation of the clinical problem. You actually pointed out a very interesting issue which I believe is important from a health economical point of view as well.
For the
health economical point of view and logistics point of view. In our center, we actually treat about 8% of our stroke cases on my secondary transportation using thrombectomy. So 80% of our patients are either keep and ship or not keep and ship or ship, but secondary transportation from hospitals.
80%.
And we do see, exactly as you said, about 50% of those secondary transportation patients finally do not get thrombectomy because of various reasons. I must say that it's only a maximum of 10% who do not get thrombectomy because of successful recanalization, but still, it is 10%, so it's a very large number for futile transplantation.
But that's because you have a majority of mothership, yeah?
Yes, no, as I said, the majority is repenship. It's 80% repenship.
80%, sorry, I heard 18.
No. Nevertheless, the point that I'm trying to make that it was extremely interesting to see the different factors that could actually influence the recanalization by IV thrombolysis. I believe it would be in the very important interest of the society to make sure that those patients who would recanalize by IV thrombolysis would not need to be further shipped because that costs a lot of money and a lot of human resources. So the problem though is that this is what I believe we need to draw the attention of the authorities, that whatever factors you found, a highly sophisticated imaging technology in the primary stroke centers, which does not exist. In most of the cases, MRI is available at the primary stroke centers.
No, maybe I was too fast, but I did show this score. Sorry, I'm looking for the slide. This score is done based on CT only. All right?
So what is the vector that you're using for the CT?
So this score has, as I said, occlusion site, CTA, NIHSS, and drip and ship or mothership. And with this score, you can predict no recanalization with greater than 90% accuracy. And for the highest score, 100%.
But I'm afraid drip and ship cannot use it as a factor for decision. Because you need to decide before you know that it was drip and ship. So what I'm saying is that if you are in a primary center, you need to make a decision whether to ship,
but if you're in a primary
or not to ship.
If you're in a primary center, it's already too late. You know it's going to be drip and ship, yeah?
Why?
If you're in the primary community center, by definition...
Okay, so maybe I'm using the wrong terminology. I'm talking about baseline, but when only IVTPA is available. That would be primary for me. Maybe
well, I don't know that. I don't know where you work. I'm not sure if
it's Hungary, but it doesn't make any difference.
No, sorry, just to complete. I had no time to discuss the possibility, which is especially in Germany being studied, and also in America, of giving thrombolysis in the ambulance. But this is still experimental, and there's no evidence so far that it is useful. It's probably going to be useful. I agree with you that if you can give thrombolysis in the ambulance, then you should give it to everybody, whatever. But once you don't, if you don't do that, when the patient is sent, the ambulance decides to send the patient to a community stroke center, then this is called drip and ship, because the patient goes there and maybe is sent to the comprehensive stroke center. Otherwise, it's mothership.
Okay, so for you, that's the community stroke center that I'm talking about. And what I'm saying is that in this case, for the community stroke centers, we would need much better and much more sophisticated imaging capacities in order to select those patients who should and should not be shipped. That's my point.
Well, I think CT and CTA is not complicated.
Then we left with the last questions. Dr. Andaros, welcome.
Thank you, Professor Martin. I would ask about serum biomarker. Serum biomarker, do you detect good prognosis or bad prognosis after TBA?
I'm sorry.
Serum biomarker. There is lab biomarker to detect
blood biomarkers. Yes, I
I had a slide about that, which I have no time to show, but it's important slide. This is what we have not studied in our papers. Clock burden score, which recently Menon et al. Jamal showed that it's something that brings together the site and the extent of the cloud. CT assessed by thrombus, we haven't done that. Thrombus perviousness is when you see the contrast going through the thrombus. So this is imaging. Thrombus volume instead of length or clot burden score. Thrombus composition. As you know now, all the thrombi collected by thrombectomy are used for research, and maybe it will be possible to determine the rate, the risk, the chance of recanalization based on thrombus composition, and therefore MRI or CT markers, and then plasma biomarkers of resistance to TPA. Some of them are listed here. PI1, the NETs, neuron external, I forgot, traps, endo something traps, and the very interesting blood biomarkers to add to our scores, and maybe with that you will be able to predict recanalization, because at the moment our scores is 20%. We cannot predict greater recanalization rate than 80%. But maybe if you have these things as plasma, maybe you will get to 95 or 100%. So it's a big, big area of research.
Thank you, Dr. Geno. Now we reach to the closure of this session, and this is the time of lunch. At the end of this floor, you turn to the right, there is the lunch. Thank you.
غدا